Good evening. Last time I was here, we talked about Daniel. We'll be turning back to the book of Daniel. We're not going to talk so much about Daniel this evening, but his three friends who are no longer, right with him every day, and they face their own challenges. But just a quick review. Daniel chapter 1. You will recall the growing Babylonian Empire comes and takes over, takes control of Jerusalem, and then eventually deports all the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding towns and villages back to Babylon. But the first stage of that, we read about here in these first few verses of Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 through 7. We see a certain group of people that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar first took from Jerusalem back to Babylon. Verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. So he's brought over these promising young guys from Jerusalem and the surrounding towns to serve in his court. And he's chosen an education course for them. He's chosen a diet for them. Verse 6, now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abed-nego. So we have Daniel now, or Belteshazzar as he's newly named. And then these other three who are given names that we really know them mostly by these newly given names the rest of the book, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Verse 8, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. We talked all about that last time I was here, and that worked out well for Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, because God blessed them, and they stood for what they knew to be right instead of just taking and eating and drinking whatever the Babylonian king gave them. Chapter 2, we're not going to study chapter 2, but just to remind you what is there, I'm sure you're familiar to one degree or another with these events. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he knew this dream was more than just an ordinary dream. I'm not sure how he knew that, but he knew that. And he calls in all of his wise men, all of his magicians, all of the people who are supposed to be able to tell him the meaning of the dream, and he demands that they tell him the meaning of the dream. But there's a catch this time. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar has gotten suspicious as to whether these guys are really what they claim to be, all these magicians and conjurers and wise men. And so he tells them, I'm not going to tell you what the dream was. You have to tell me what I dreamed. If you can do that, then I'll believe that your interpretation of the dream has some kind of basis. If you can't tell me what my dream was, then I'll know that you're not what you've all been claiming to be. And of course they object and say, well, how can we can't tell you what you dreamed. Well, then why should you believe anything they say? And that's what Nebuchadnezzar realized. And so he becomes pretty upset with all of this and decides to have them all killed. All his wise men, all the conjurers, all the Chaldeans that serve in this kind of capacity. And we read in verse 13, so the decree to have them all killed, chapter 2, verse 13. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. He's just done with all of these kind of people. Of course, Daniel and his friends aren't really that kind of people. But Nebuchadnezzar assumes they are, and so he's included them in the ones to be killed. And we read there in verse 14, then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. And so Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. So Daniel knows that he's got a source that might be willing to let him know what the king dreamed, the Lord. And so he asks the king, can you give me a little bit of time? See what I can do. And of course, the Lord reveals the dream to Daniel. Daniel goes back to the king. He's confused to that with Joseph in Egypt. I told you the wrong dream. I'm not inspired like Daniel was. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar has on this occasion, well, when you're speaking, you should really look at your notes more. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar has on this occasion, nothing to do with corn and cows. You can edit this out of the video. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is of that great statue made of the gold and the silver and all of those different materials that represented the kingdoms that flowed through history from this time until the time of Christ. And Nebuchadnezzar is very thankful to Daniel. Very appreciative that Daniel has been able to interpret the dream, and he rewards Daniel. We read in verse 46 of chapter 2, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel, and gave orders to present to him an offering of fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you've been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel, and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego over the administrations of the provinces of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. So Daniel and his three friends are no longer together. Daniel has been promoted to a level above them. Daniel is serving in the king's court. His friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, are out kind of serving over provinces of Babylon. And that's how we come to these events of chapter 3 that we're going to be looking at this evening, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego on their own, separated from Daniel. And we'll set the stage for these events with chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. Now, 60 cubits, this is going to be an approximation, but that's about 90 feet tall. As I look at this illustration, they've maybe drawn that statue a little bit too tall. But it was a giant statue made of gold. And Nebuchadnezzar has built this great statue, put it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, and there at the end of verse 1. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. A king, a leader of a country, builds some great thing, and he wants everybody there to celebrate the establishment of this thing. And this thing, in Nebuchadnezzar's case, is an object of worship. At least he tells them that it's an object to worship. So verse 3, then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, and the treasurers, and the judges, and the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. Remember, they've taken in a lot of people from a lot of different countries at this point. And so, among all of these people, even in these governing positions, are people from different lands and different languages. The command, verse 5, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego are among all of these officials that are brought before this giant statue that Nebuchadnezzar has built, commanded everyone to worship. What are they going to do? So that's the stage set. And as the process on that day continued, we find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego accused of not doing what they were supposed to do. And they had not done what they were supposed to do. They didn't worship the image. But they're accused for that. We'll comment on that after we read these verses. Verses 8 through 12. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You yourself, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. That's what the king had said. And these accusers say in verse 12, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. How crazy is it? How crazy is it to be accused of some bad thing that you didn't bow down to a big piece of metal? How crazy is that? And yet society goes in a direction and it begins to worship these things because, well, we've carved it into the shape of a statue of a giant man. So you should worship this big piece of metal because it's shaped like a man. And if for no other reason, because the king told you to. And we just go along with whatever the king says. That's really the case with all accusations against the faithful, that what they're being accused of, it's crazy accusations. Because God established an order of goodness, an order of good things, an order of truth, and that's what makes sense. And it's diversions from that are crazy. It's worshiping this giant piece of metal that's crazy. It's having intimate relations with just all the kinds of people you come across that's crazy. God has established an order, and that's what's good. And those who are serving the Lord get accused when they do the good things and refuse to do the crazy things. And that's the kind of thing that we fix, because society goes away from what is good. You're familiar with Romans chapter 1. Verses 21 to 23 are the verses that I will read here. As Paul is describing pagan society and how it's turned away from the sense of what is true and right. Romans chapter 1, verse 21. For even though they knew God, all the people of pagan societies, they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. They began speculating, oh, what about this? What about this idea? What about this concept? What about worshiping this instead of worshiping God? Oh, that is futility. Their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Man turns away and worships images shaped like people and animals instead of worshiping the one who created men and animals. And they want to call the Christians crazy and out of line for worshiping the Creator. When you're accused of not going along with society, when there's pressure on you to do things that you know are wrong, remember their view, their practice is the one that's crazy, not yours. Don't feel like nobody else around me is serving the Lord and nobody else is taking a stand. I feel like I'm going to stick out like a crazy person. They're the crazy people. Remember that. In 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter chapter 4, beginning in verse 2. Let's begin in verse 1. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. The time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desires of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousals, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And in all of this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excess of dissipation, and they malign you as if you're the one out of line, as if you're the one making bad choices. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were accused, and we will be accused in that same way as we read there in 1 Peter. And we need to know that that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. We need to be ready for that. We need to know, okay, sometime today, this week, this month, this year, somebody's going to look at me with an accusing expression on their face, or they're just going to out and out say it, that I'm doing crazy things. No, we stick with the Lord and we're doing what is right. But here in John chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, and this is the judgment, that the light is come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. So they try to make you feel bad or guilty or unintelligent or not sophisticated because you don't go along with their thinking. We will be accused like that. But we're not the oddballs. They are. We know the way God made this world and how to live by it. Well, besides being accused, there's a threat that goes along with that. Because Nebuchadnezzar had said, if you don't worship the giant statue of gold, then you're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. So we read in verses 13 through 15. Let me get back to Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, that you did not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" And it seems he doesn't give them a chance to answer because he's an autocratic king. He says then, "Now if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you will not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" So there's the threat. You're going to be cast into this fiery furnace. The world is going to try to make you do things that the world does, and they're going to create circumstances of one kind or of another. Can't talk. They're going to create circumstances of one kind or another that you're going to have to suffer because you're unwilling to do the things they want to do. You're unwilling to go along with the practices that they practice. It might be something minor. It might be that they just don't want to be your friend anymore. Well, okay. We ought to be willing to accept that. It might be something more significant. It might be associated with your job. It might mean you don't get a promotion that you wanted to get and you would have gotten, but you won't bend to this company practice because you know it's wrong. And so now you're not going to get the promotion. Or you may even lose your job because you won't go along with what your business wants you to do. Sometimes Christians cave into those things. We're going to face other things in our society with so much of our society on a liberal course, accepting all kinds of things and wanting everyone to accept those things. When we don't accept those things, eventually there's probably going to be some consequences on us, besides just that they say we're out of touch with reality. But maybe legal consequences, maybe convictions. In Acts chapter 4, the apostles, Peter and John in particular, are dragged before the court because they are preaching the resurrection of Jesus. And in Acts chapter 4, verses 17 through 20, here they are. They're being accused. They're facing possible consequences, threatened with possible consequences. And they say in chapter 4, verse 17, or the Jews and the court, as they are discussing what they're going to do with Peter and John, say in verse 17, "But in order that it may not spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no more to any man in this name." When they had summoned Peter and John, they commanded them to not speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, "Whether it's right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking what we have seen and heard." I like the definition, the definitiveness with which they say this. They don't simply say, we don't want to stop preaching this. We're not going to stop preaching this. So we cannot stop preaching this because we've seen it and we've heard it. There's no way. We cannot do what you want us to do. And we're going to have to take stands like that sometimes. What will you do on those occasions? What do you do on those occasions? Well, back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, chapter 3, verse 16 in Daniel. They defended their faith in God. Nebuchadnezzar had said, "What God is there who can deliver you from my fiery furnace?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego defended their faith in God. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. They defended their faith. When we encounter those kind of situations, defend your faith. Stand up for your faith. You believe in it? Defend it. You believe the way of God is right? Defend it. Defend that God is real and that God is leading you and that what you're doing is what our Creator God says should be done. Well, then they demonstrated their faith. They defended their faith in verse 16 and 17, but they really demonstrate their faith in verse 18. But even if he does not, even if God doesn't deliver us from that furnace of fire, even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up. They know God can deliver them. They think God is going to deliver them. But they say, even if he doesn't, we still believe in him. And we still are going to follow him. And we're still not going to worship your gods. When you're accused, when you're threatened, defend your faith and demonstrate your faith. That no matter what the consequences are, you're going to do what God teaches you to do. Whatever difficult situation that may be that you're in. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were vindicated. We'll all be vindicated. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego would have been vindicated either way, whether God allowed them to die in the furnace or he saved them from that fire. They would be vindicated. It's just their vindication wouldn't be obvious for a while if God allowed them to burn in the furnace. Their vindication, the demonstration that they were right, would only come in the resurrection. They would be resurrected to life while Nebuchadnezzar is condemned to punishment. But they were vindicated in the moment. Chapter 3, verses 19 through 27. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, along with Daniel, are young men that Nebuchadnezzar had seen value in and had exalted to higher positions. And now these three young men are rebelling against him. So his face is altered. He had looked upon them kindly on previous occasions. But not now that they say, we don't care what you do, we're not going to worship your God. His facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astounded and stood up in haste, and he responded and said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered, said to the king, "Certainly, O king." He answered and said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor did the smell of the fire even come upon them. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, their faith, their refusal to go along with what everybody in that society thought, yeah, this is normal, we'll do this. The king said do it, we have to do it. They had refused to go along with that, and they were vindicated in the moment. They would have been vindicated either way, like I said. If they died, then they would have been vindicated in the resurrection. They were fortunate enough, blessed enough, to be vindicated in the moment. When we face accusations and threats because we want to do what the Lord says do, we might be vindicated in the moment, or maybe not. Maybe we won't be vindicated in the moment, but there will be a day when we will be vindicated. And people will see at the great day of judgment that we were the ones who made the right decision by insisting on following what the Lord says instead of doing whatever everybody else around is doing. Last thing I want to notice, I don't have on the screen, but their faith was shared with Nebuchadnezzar. Did you hear Nebuchadnezzar's words there? In verse 26, he refers to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, you servants of the Most High God. In verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego shall be torn limb from limb, their houses reduced to rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. The king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Now, I'm not convinced that Nebuchadnezzar lived the rest of his days, converting to Judaism and really following the law of Moses and all of that. But he did then recognize the one most powerful God, the only God who could save men in that kind of situation. And that's a step. And when we stand for what is right, some people will notice that. And some people will have some thoughts maybe similar to Nebuchadnezzar's. That maybe there's something to this person's faith, and to the God this person serves, the God you serve. Maybe they'll go farther than that. We'll end with Matthew chapter 5. Jesus speaking in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, beginning verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It's good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do men light a lamp and put it under the peck measure, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And with that thought, we'll end our lesson for this evening. If you have some need to come before this group tonight, ask for prayers or whatever your need may be, we ask that you come as we stand and sing.
Would you look for Jesus and be always good?
Tells the king what he had dreamed. I decided to do that part without looking at my verses, and